Give me just another 15 seconds here and we'll get going. I'm here to re-record the video from earlier today on the typing engine, or the quote-unquote typing of the dead engine. And we'll cover this in just a second. Okay. Ooh, excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay, so this video is being made for a handful of people, specifically on, well, anywhere, I guess, right? This all started because I had played a game over at a friend's house called Typing of the Dead, and I was sure that creating some type of system like that shouldn't be too difficult. I'm not talking about the excuse me. I'm not talking about the the graphics, right? Or, you know, the zombies, or the animations and all the 3D modeling, all that stuff. That's all different. I'm talking strictly just the engine around displaying a random word up on screen, you know, checking the player's input as they're attempting to type it, and giving the player either audible or visual feedback as to whether or not their keystrokes were accurate. Excuse me, guys. I have to just take a quick sip of water here. Okay. So first thing is first, right? You see that this is not, well, I'll show you the product first. This is what we're looking like. This is just a little something I slapped together. I called it Word Stacker. Press enter, and once you hit enter, you start typing. Boorish. All right. Keeps a record in the top right of the number of words you completed. Gives you some audible feedback as you're typing the correct key. If you hit an incorrect key, right? Oh. Ah. Oh no! Alright, so I ended up with only 12 words. A couple of seconds later, knocks you back to the main screen. You know what I didn't add? I guess it doesn't matter because it's not full screen. I can always just click the X. So that's what we're looking at. Specifically, we're looking at the mechanisms involved in creating a list of words, right? Well, let's even take a step back, right? We'll create a list. We'll add to that list a list of words. We will randomly select one of those words from the list. We'll count the number of digits or the number of characters in that word string, and then we'll actually parse out all of those individual characters, and we'll add them to their own created list, right? So we'll have a list of all the words, and then as a word is selected, the letters from any one word are pieced out into the the letters list, right? So if I have ant, for example, position 0 would be A in the list, position 1 would be N, position 2 would be T, right? Position 0, 1, 2. Weird, I know. So let's just kind of start from the top, because I can run through all of the, this is a single object, right? The objects that you see for the other rooms are just to control the, you know, press enter and showing you the score. All of the meat and potatoes of this is really just in room 0 object. Room 0 is the actual gameplay room. So we'll start in our create, right? First thing I want to do for a game like this is make sure that you randomize it, because otherwise you're just going to keep getting the same words over and over again. Not the same words, the same progression of words as you play. I create a game and frame counter here. I call it a frame counter. It's not really counting one frame at a time. This game does run at 60 frames a second. So even though it says 60, I'm actually deducing or reducing frame timer every frame by a factor of 5, right? So each Well, we'll get to that when we get to that, right? So you'll see a game timer, the max count of the game timer, which will actually be used in some measurements for drawing some stuff on screen. Hey, Noah. Welcome aboard. I'm just kind of running through a little program that some friends of mine were requesting to take a look at on the Game Maker subreddit. This is a typing engine similar to that of a game called Typing of the Dead. If you're familiar with that, we're just kind of running through this. They were interested in how the code looked, at least my iteration of it. So the game timer and the game timer max are used a little bit later in the draw event. We'll show you that in a bit. The frame timer I'd mentioned before is reduced by a factor of 5, or by 5, or not a factor of 5, each frame. A couple of another initial variable declarations. The score, we didn't. The good question here is if I don't make score 0, what is score as a built-in variable by default? I would assume it's 0. So I just, cover my ass, right? A little CYA, just make sure that we initialize our score as 0 every time we play the game. We have what's called a letter counter that we're going to equate to 1, as well as letter, which will equate to 0. We'll look at that a little further down the line. Letter counter is I believe, used for the position within the letter list, right? So if we're at position 1, this is the letter. Position 2, that's the letter, so on and so forth. Oh, looks like we lost Noah already. That's all right. Because really, I'm streaming this solely to just record it and get it onto YouTube. This isn't really a stream. I'm looking for a bunch of people here anyway. So then, next step is we're going to create the words list. Very simple. Give it a name. It equals a data structure of the list type create. DSList create. Then we're going to use DSList add to add those words to the newly created words list using these words. Now, the one cool thing about this is I found the Typing of the Dead words list available online. Unfortunately, it does not include, it does come, 1 word per row, right? So it's just a single column of words, which is nice, especially because it made for editing the quotation marks as well as adding the comma, right? I mean, this list goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And I only took a tiny fraction of the words that were available. This game was ridiculous. I don't know how many freaking words Typing of the Dead really has. But unfortunately, if you're not familiar with, you could use sed. Sed is probably the best text editor to add in something like this. But because it's the list is already structured so simply, that means it's just a single column. I decided to use awk, AWK. If anybody's not familiar with awk, it's a Unix program or Linux program. It's like a text and manipulator and text editor, stuff like that. So what I did was there is a command that I wrote that essentially just takes my input, which is this list without the commas and the double quotes, runs it through my awk command, which adds the double quotes and the comma, right? And then I just copied and pasted that right into here, and I didn't have to do any other editing. You can find an online awk editor or an awk compiler. It's a simple Google search will get you there, okay? Awk is extremely popular. If you work in IT, you know what I'm talking about. So we've added our words to our list. Here's all the potential words that we could get while we're playing our game. All right, I didn't want to go too big because this is just a shell of this system, right? If you wanted to create multiple lists based on a difficulty, you could do that, right? And then pull from whatever specific list based on whatever difficulty is chosen, or if the player has progressed into the game a certain amount, right? If there's some timer that you're keeping behind the scenes, what have you. All right. So what we do is, once the words are added to our list, we count the number of words in the list, right? Then we randomly select a word. Now we do that with DS list size, passing through the list, which in this case is the words. We select a word randomly from the list and store that word for later use, right? So we're going to find a value, right? DS list find value in the words list at any range, right? Because we counted the size of the list, I can just pass through word count here, and it's always going to be the maximum number of the list. So let's say down the line I wanted to add more words. I don't have to come through and find this anymore because we're counting the size of the list programmatically. We're not hard coding anything in. We're going to count the number of characters in the string that's chosen. In the string, I'm going to add this word that is chosen. Okay, that's simply using string length and then passing through the test word that was selected in the step above. And then we're going to create a secondary list to store the individual letters of the word that was selected. So we're creating a second list as letter list, passing it through, or titling it letter list. We're not passing through anything here. Then what we do is we loop through the selected word by each character and then add that character to the list that was just newly created. All right, allows us to access the word in a list instead of a string, which I'm sure there's ways that you could do this without having to parse this out into a list. I just find that manipulating lists and accessing lists seems a little bit cleaner. I haven't looked at it from like a debug standpoint to see which one is, you know, hitting the CPU harder, although this game, it's not hitting the CPU hard at all, I would have to imagine. And then, right, so what we do here, this is just a simple for loop, right? Because we know the length of the word, we can specify that I is 0, and as long as I is less than or equal to the test word length, we are going to run this code, which basically declares a quick local variable, makes that equal to whatever the letter is at that position, right? Because I is going to increment, so we start at 0 in the list, right? The position in the list is 0. The first position in a list is 0, then 1, then 2, not counting up from 1, counting up from 0. And then we add that list to the we add that letter to our list using the add list, right? List add. These things down here, I don't think I use later. I had them as kind of my own thing. So what I did was I counted the number of letters in the newly created list of letters, right? So if it's the word this is going to return 3, right? So the reason that I did it is that I then pass it through as a string to the debug messenger down here. So what I did was, as I was typing in the letters while I was kind of building and testing this, as I typed the correct letter, I would display on debug message the number 1, then the number 2, then the number 3. So what I was looking to see was, you know, did my word complete on number 3, knowing that letter count was going to equal 3, right? My input matched up with what I thought my game should expect, or what the game was expecting. Going down to my step. We'll get to this stuff in just a second. This is really just updating the stuff from the screen before, because it constantly needs to be updated, right? Because we're going to be choosing new words and new letters have to be determined and so on and so forth. So this should make sense already if you're already making games. You'll notice too, I'm one of these guys that sometimes uses semicolons and sometimes doesn't. I am like the sloppiest coder I've ever seen. But anyway, getting down to the frame counter, we'd mentioned this before. Every frame, this amount is reduced by 5. Hey, Bendo. And if that amount happens to be less than or equal to 0, we are going to reduce my timer by 1 and then reset this timer back to 60. If the game's timer happens to be less than or equal to 0, we go to this room, which is my game over screen that shows you just game over, here's your score, right? And then I also pass through the game timer into a debug message here so I can see, this was before, I could probably get rid of this. This was before I had the score up in the top right. That was the way that I was, or not the score, rather, the, how do you call, the timer up in the top right, so I knew how much time I had left just by peeking down in the debug. We'll get to the draw event in a second. That's the last one we want to look at. Now, I use the event of pressing any key. And that's because this game is BWT making another game. Bindo, I am constantly working on all sorts of stuff. Not necessarily that we're working on anything that's like specific, but you know, if something comes of maybe a piece of this would go nice with a piece of that, and you kind of put it together, and boom, you got a game. Appreciate you bringing up BWT though, Bindo. If anybody here hasn't seen it yet, my game, our game, BWT's game, is called Bfender. It's available for 99 cents on the Steam Marketplace. Okay, so because I use any key, I'm kind of using it in conjunction. Once I discovered that this built-in variable existed, then it was kind of game on, right? This is a built-in variable that will record the last single key pressed by the keyboard, right? So letter, right? As letter counter is being incremented as we press the correct key, right? Letter counter is going to see, because we're looking at finding the value in the list of letters at this position, right? So this starts at, you know, 0 or 1, whatever, increments up to 2. So if it's, again, the word the, it starts at the letter T. We press the letter T, it goes to the letter H, so on and so forth down the line, okay? So if we click the correct letter, we play a little keystroke, random keystroke sound that I found online, just to kind of give the player some audible feedback. We show a debug message in the bottom that shows us the letter that we had clicked, or that we had typed. Or no, not the letter itself, the counter of the letter. So it'd be the position within the string of the word, right? So we're counting up, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, what's the word the? 1, 2, 3. Boom. It should equal whatever we said test word length was before, right? And then we increment the letter counter by 1, like I'd said before. Or else, if it doesn't equal the letter, and it doesn't equal one of the shift keys, play the sound that I'm designating as the wrong key. The only reason that I'm segregating out the shift key is because this game is going to be what's the word I'm looking for? Case sensitive, right? So some words are going to be capitalized, some are not. Obviously, I noticed that when I was playing it the first time that I didn't have this check in here, when I'd go to capitalize a word, I'd hear that sound that meant that I was typing the wrong key, and it was kind of throwing me off. Also, the other thing you'll note too is that in the game it's supposed to have some type of visual feedback, right? The letters will show up on screen as you type them. That's coming, right? That's not really that shouldn't be too difficult if we're looking at what we have here. I just haven't had the time to get to finishing it. But moving on, if our letter counter, right, the little piece that's jumping through the list of letters becomes greater or equal to that of the count of letters, then we essentially, what this is saying is, if you've typed the word completely, right, we increment the score by 1. We increment the game timer by the amount of letters that were in the word that you just completed, which I thought was kind of a neat thing, right? So you have some, you know, if you can start really getting a groove and start cranking out some words real quick, you can fill back up your timer. Haven't tweaked with the levels of that or any, you know, progression of that. Just a little something that'll end the game, essentially, right? The timer was, and I thought, you know, what's a better way than just making it a 60-second game or whatnot? We play the sound of the ref whistle, right? We clear the list of letters, not the list of words. This is the list that's holding each individual letter, because we're done with this word, right? So we're clearing that list, and then we're resetting our counter back to 1. And then we go through the same steps as we did in create again. We select our word, we count its length, and then we pass the length into our for loop here to parse out that word into its own letter list, right? Rinse and repeat after every single word is completed. Getting back to the draw event, this is the stuff that I'm terrible at. is the math behind gaming. So the first thing that I do was I knew that I wanted my text to align just like a book text, right? It starts on the left side of the screen and types out to the right. It's probably the default setting, so I don't think I needed to say this, but that's what this is here. We're just aligning my draw to go from the left to the right, okay? Then we just simply draw the text at this X, this Y. Room height is a built-in, you know what, if you guys use GameMaker, you know what room height is. I'll spare you. Room height div 2, so essentially it's going to put it like right in the middle of the room as relative to the Y-axis, right, up and down. So it's going to be like here, right, like on the game screen, not here on my monitor. We pass through what the test word is, and then we color all 4 corners of it white and make sure that our alpha is set to 1 so that it's as bright on screen as it can be. Now this bit here, this is what draws the underscores or the spaces for where the letters will eventually show up as you're typing them, okay? You pass through the count of the letters in that list so you know exactly how many letters or how many spaces and underscores there need to be. And what we do inside the loop is a simple check if the character in the string that we're looking at right now is or is not a space. If it's not a space, which is what this is asking here, if the character in the string at position 1, position 1, we have to add the 1 here because we initialize at 0. Some weird stuff happens when I change I to 1. I haven't quite looked into that yet. I'm not overly familiar with why that was throwing that off, but nonetheless, I initialize the loop at 0, and then we just increment it in the if statement here. And then obviously I is going to increment itself because that's the third expression that we've passed through here, or the third statement that we've passed through here. So essentially, if the character that we're looking at is not a space, draw an underscore at, these are going to be arbitrary, right? You can figure out wherever you want to put your own words. So again, if it's not a space, draw an underscore plus a space, right? You want to have a little space between them, so there's actually a space there. Or else, draw a space, right? It's either an underscore or a space, and it knows based on the letters that are in the list what to draw. Below that, we're drawing our rectangle. This is the outline of my little timer bar. This is my the red portion of it that's shrinking as the game is playing, right? This part here specifically is where it can get wonky. So when I say game timer over game timer max, this is where the math, this is, admittedly, I'm so stupid with math that this is one of the things that took the longest for me to realize. So game timer over game timer max, we can say as the game initially begins, when you have 60 seconds on the clock or whatever, when the game timer equals 60, it also equals game timer max to 60. So this is 60 over 60, or 1. So our second Y location is going to be at 101 plus 1 times 558. Okay? And then as the timer shrinks, that's going to start to fraction the answer to our calculation here, right? And eventually it's going to get to 0, which would be when the game timer is at 0, right? 0 over game timer max. Obviously you can't divide by 0, so Nothing's going to happen there. The game doesn't break because you try to divide by 0, but when we've already set earlier that when game timer is less than or equal to 0, we go to the next room. This isn't necessary for this type of game, right? But it's fun to look at. And then we just draw the score. And that's it. Extremely simple. Again, the big things are, I'll let you screenshot it if you need to, right? This, once you get to your list, you can add whatever the hell you want to add. And this, in the create, this, in your, at least in my, again, I use the any key press, this in your step. See all the stuff that I've commented out earlier while I was testing it. And then this in your draw. And that's it, guys. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope I see some projects on the Game Maker subreddit in the future using this type of mechanic, because I think I'm going to try to see if I can't make something work with it. All right, we will talk soon.